In the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring to control all others, but there were some who resisted. A last alliance of men and elves marched against the armies of Mordor, and on the slopes of Mount Doom, they fought for the freedom of Middle-earth. But the power of the ring could not be undone.
Hey guys, what's happening? Niyat here with Film Comics Explained, and today we're going to be continuing our exploration into Sauron with a look at his foul deeds throughout the Second Age. If you haven't seen part 1 to this video covering Sauron in the First Age, there's a link below, and I highly recommend you watch that before viewing this video. All that aside, the Second Age began, and 500 years into it, Sauron popped up again. 500 years after that, he began building Barad-dûr, the great tower from the Lord of the Rings. I've already talked about Sauron and the creation of the Rings of Power in another video, but the key point essentially is that nobody knew it was Sauron at this time, as he'd taken on a fair form and called himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. Some elves like Elrond and Gil-galad were suspicious of him, but others like Celebrimbor listened to him. He taught them about the art of crafting that he'd learnt as a servant of Aiol, and together they crafted the Rings of Power. When Sauron put on the One Ring, the elves immediately knew him for who he was, and this kick-started an open war between Sauron and the elves. This period was called the Black Years and the Years of Flight, due to the fact that as Sauron got the upper hand in the war, a lot of elves left Middle-earth for Valinor in the west. That was until the Númenóreans arrived in Middle-earth in full force and put a stop to him. The Númenóreans were essentially a race of men who were descendant from Eärendil the Mariner, and were granted long life and an island called Númenor between Middle-earth and Valinor. They became a powerful seafaring nation, and in the time of Tar-Minster, the 11th king of Númenor, they helped the elves in a decisive battle against Sauron and forced him to withdraw to Mordor. Sauron continued to fight both the elves and the Númenóreans, who had begun constructing settlements on the coast of Middle-earth, until the time of Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, the 24th and mightiest of the Númenórean kings and queens. Sauron had taken the title of King of Men for himself, and was attempting to drive the Númenóreans into the sea. Ar-Pharazôn was proud and power-hungry, and wanted the title of King of Men for himself, so he travelled to Middle-earth from Númenor with a great army with the intent of capturing Sauron, and Sauron came out to meet him. But having your throat mauled by a giant wolf teaches you a thing or two about power, and the power of Ar-Pharazôn was massive. Sauron made no show of force, but, being crafty, decided patience and subtlety would be more effective weapons in taking down the Númenóreans. He put on his fairest form and humbled himself before the Númenórean king. Ar-Pharazôn took Sauron back to the island of Númenor as a captive, and Sauron was more than happy to comply. It is interesting to note that at this point, Sauron still had the One Ring, but instead of using it, he left it in Barad-dûr. With his cunning mind and silver tongue, Sauron became one of the closest advisors of the king within 3 years. He then began turning the king against the worship of the Valar and convinced him to start worshipping Melkor, his old master. From this point onwards, things started going badly for the Númenóreans. Sauron had the White Tree of Valinor that stood in the courts cut down and burnt. Before he did this though, Isildur stole a fruit from the tree, which would later be planted in Gondor and be the symbol of the nation. Isildur, his father Elendil, and brother Anorion were part of the faithful, Númenóreans who still worshipped the Valar and Ilúvatar. Sauron persecuted the faithful by charging them with crimes on false pretenses, and in the Great Temple with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, which essentially meant that they were making human sacrifices to Melkor. The Númenóreans, and especially Ar-Pharazôn, feared death, and Sauron had promised them that these human sacrifices to Melkor would release them from death. But instead, death had come sooner and more often because Sauron was turning man against man. Meanwhile, Ar-Pharazôn grew in power and became the mightiest tyrant since Morgoth, but it was Sauron who was pulling the strings. With Númenor at his feet and the king under his control, he decided it was time for the next step in his grand plan. He told the king about Valinor, the deathless realm where the gods lived, and said that if Númenor were to wage war on the gods and conquer Valinor, then they would have everlasting life. Ar-Pharazôn was very old by this stage and would likely die soon, and he had grown so powerful and prideful that he agreed and began constructing the biggest fleet the world had ever seen. In that time, the fleets of the Númenóreans darkened the sea upon the west of the land, and they were like an archipelago of 1,000 isles. Their masts were as a forest upon the mountains, and their sails like a brooding cloud, and their banners were golden and black. When everything was ready, Ar-Pharazôn moved his navies against the Lords of the West. Sauron remained on Númenor because he knew exactly what was going to happen. He'd seen the Lords of the West sink a continent and banish his former lord to the outer void. He had brought about the end of his enemy without armies, fighting, or even using the One Ring. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle, and again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm. What Sauron didn't expect, however, was that the Valar would call upon Ilúvatar, who had little to do with the world since its creation, and Ilúvatar answered by opening a massive chasm which sunk not only the entire fleet, but also all of Númenor. And Sauron, laughing gleefully in his temple, was sucked down into the depths as well. The chasm was so deep that it forever split Valinor from Middle-earth, to the extent that where before the world was flat, it had now become round, and if you sailed west in a straight line, you would end up where you started. Unless you were an elf, but that's another story. Sauron, using nothing but words, had caused the reshaping of the entire world, which is an incredible feat if you ask me. Sauron, being a Maia, didn't die when the world was changed, but his physical form was destroyed, so his spirit rose from the waters and returned to Barad-dûr. He put on the ring again and made a new form, but from that point on, he was no longer able to change his shape at will or appear in a form beautiful to look at. Instead, he takes the form we see in The Lord of the Rings. Well, that's all for today, folks. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video on Sauron. There were many requests to cover more Tolkien content, and I was happy to oblige. I know a lot of this was quite dense. Sorry guys, that is the way that Tolkien writes. Heath and I have done our best to transpose it and make it more accessible. If there's any other stuff you'd like me to check out, please don't hesitate to ask. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification icon to stay up to date on all my content. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.
Tunyikan marka. Umidishu. Ashir. Borzumishi.
I am not alone.
You should have stayed dead.